Cool. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the London Archives. My name is Tom. I'm an engagement learning officer here at the London Archives. So welcome to those of you joining us in the building, and welcome to those of you joining us from at home as well. Just a couple of very quick pieces of housekeeping before we start, mostly for the benefit of people at home. My colleague Rachel will be in the chat. Hopefully all the technology is working okay. You can see me, hear me, and the slides are moving and the like. Any problems with that, please feel free to pop that in the chat, and Rachel will do her best to get that sorted out for you. We'll take questions, but if we can, just to keep things a bit more straightforward, we'll take questions at the end from both the people who've joined us in the room and for those of you at home as well. And we've got a couple come in, just a couple of people joining us in the building, plenty of seats wherever you like. So we'll take questions at the end, but if you are joining us from home, please feel free to pop them in the chat as you go along. If you're anything like me, you'll think of a question, the time will come at the end and you'll forget what it is, so feel free to pop them in as you like. So over the next sort of 45 minutes or so, we'll be hopefully enjoying a talk entitled Shadows and Sunlight in Victorian London. The sort of somewhat poetic title for this talk comes from this book, London, A Pilgrimage, that appeared in London in sort of the latter part of the 19th century. And this is part of a larger body and eclectic corpus of works, which saw those with a degree of wealth and security trying to understand and describe the lives of people that had a lot less of both of those things. It's a very big literature, and I'm not going to try and be anything like comprehensive today in my treatment of it. So I have a more modest goal. I want to show you some of the examples of it that feature in our collections here at the London Archives, how you can access those collections, particularly online, and with the help of a few online resources from other friends and institutions of ours as well, and draw out a little bit more detail on some of the examples of this genre that feature in our exhibition, which is running until January next year. So that's the plan, as I say, for the next sort of 45 minutes or so. Before we get really stuck in to this literature, I think it'd be important to have a little bit of context. So London in the 19th century changes a huge amount from start to the end of the century, and the pace of change and the scale of change was strongly noted by people at the time, the people that were living through it. Sometimes the comparisons you will read to London in the 19th century is to the mega cities of the developing world today, and that's a good comparison in some regards. We see rapid changes in population, rapid changes of growth, and the infrastructure of the city not really being able to keep up with that growth. So with various social and sanitary problems that can ensue, as well as big problems with inequality of wealth as well. So it's an important thing to fix in our mind, that comparison. But there's a point, and I think a very important point, where that comparison breaks down, is because in the developing cities, in the large cities of the developing world today, there is at least a model. There's a sense of a trajectory. London at this time was not only the biggest city in the world, it was the biggest city the world had ever known. Many things that we take for granted today as features of urban living had to be either invented or invented to cater for people on that scale. So there's a real sense of precedent, of novelty, of experiment that infuses London at this time. That's I think a very important context for those people who were living through it. And we can get a sense of that change, the scale of that change, with some raw numbers. So in 1801, that's the date of the first census, the population of London is little over 1 million people. By 1860, we're talking in terms of about 3 million people, and then by 1900, at the century's close, about 6.5 million people. So an absolutely massive growth in population as things go along. And as I said, this therefore meant living in London was a different experience to people than only a few generations before. And this, I should say, would have been true of the great industrial cities, particularly the north as well, but particularly pronounced in London. Because before this massive urbanisation of the country, which London, as we've heard, is the biggest example, people lived in relatively small towns or even villages. So one comparison that is used is that in the 19th century, at the start of the century, the scale of living was something like that of a modern university, in that you wouldn't necessarily know everybody, you wouldn't sort of be acquainted with everybody, but you would sort of be familiar with people. There wouldn't be that many sort of strangers. You'd have a sense at least of the people that you were sort of sharing your environment with. But as the century rolls on, that breaks down. And people are living effectively with strangers, side by side with strangers. Big parts of the city are strange and alien and even threatening to them as well. So that sense of strangeness of growth was fueled by the fact that the population growth in London really was in the large part a byproduct of migration, both people coming to London from other parts of the country, from Ireland and the rest of Europe as well. Again, all adding to this sense of growth and strangeness. And therefore, in this sort of this confusion, people started to feel the need to have guides to try and understand the city, to sort of work out what was happening, and maybe to plan a way through to reform and improve the living and sometimes working conditions for its inhabitants as well. And this brings us to the first figure that we're going to look at. This is Henry Mayhew, a sort of fairly egg-shaped figure by this illustration, which is part of his most famous work. London Labour and the London Poor. One of the perils of this literature is lots of the titles have the word London, Labour and Poor in some combination, so sometimes have to refer the notes to make sure I get them in precisely the right order. So London Labour and the London Poor, we can read its description from the introduction on the screen here, is considered the first seminal work in this. It's often described as social journalism, documentary journalism. And by that what we mean by is people trying to understand the living and working conditions of London's poor, but from an outsider's perspective. And what we'll see in Mayhew is a tension that really runs throughout the genre, throughout the discipline of study, is really an outsider trying to understand the lives of other people, trying to understand a sort of a society that he's not part of. Usually, again, in the case of Mayhew, through some combination of social conscience, but also some combination of profit and some kind of other motive as well. So Mayhew was a journalist and as well as a playwright, alongside his advocacy for reform. He's probably most famous in his journalistic sense for being one of the co-founders of the satirical magazine Punch, which was founded in 1841, and was the magazine's joint editor in its early days, alongside Mark Lemon. But in terms of his journalistic work, he became well known at the time for his work in the Morning Chronicle, and it was a series of articles in the Morning Chronicle that were later compiled into the work London Labour and the London Poor. And it's really this work. It's in this book form that this work is best known to us. It's come down to us as a multi-volume book, 4 volumes in 4 volumes in total. The first 3 concentrating on London, and the 4th with them all offering a context to the rest of the country. And we can see that London Labour and the London Poor is described as a cyclopedia of the condition earnings of those that will work, those that cannot work, and those that will not work. And the first 3 volumes that refer to London are divided along those lines. We understand that Mayhew first became interested in this in sort of the plight, he might have described it, of the working classes or the poor in London after a visit to Bermondsey in 1849, and the context of this was the cholera epidemic at the time. So cholera appears in London from Asia around about this time, and it was a devastating and shocking illness for people. We now know today, of course, that it's spread by dirty water, but at the time that wasn't, when it arrived that wasn't known, and there were various competing theories, and most famously the miasma theory of cholera, which thought that cholera was spread by bad air, by noxious gases and noxious smells. And what was particularly shocking for victims of cholera is how you could basically be well in the morning and dead by the evening. Such was the consequences of the severe dehydration it caused through diarrhea. And this idea of people sort of being alive in the morning and dead by dinner was seen as part of a general sense that the city kind of wasn't working. Something was amiss, and that kind of reform might have been needed, at least by Mayhew at this time. But this is something that becomes more prevalent as the century rolls on. And I won't sort of bore you by reading this whole thing there, but I hope you do get a sense from this excerpt of the type of prose that is used, and they're quite lurid in places, and really the kind of the way in which these districts are being cast as sort of a dangerous and ill places, and how kind of whole areas are kind of painted with the same brush. So if Mayhew was inspired to start this work by the cholera epidemics, the work continued with a sense of him trying to get to know the people of this underclass, as he might have called it. So it's sometimes described as an ethnographic work, in that he's talking to people on their own terms. He's trying not to impose too much a judgment, although it does tend to creep through a little bit from time to time. And he's trying to reproduce their speech in their own words. And here we can see an example of when Mayhew visits a lodging house, or a common lodging house, giving a sense of what it means, of how thin the margins are in people's between kind of comfort and discomfort, and how really how precarious life is. So if he gets a little bit of money, if he's got 4 pence, he can sleep and be comfortable. He's talking about people saying their prayers there. So there's a lot of kind of moral judgments that come in this genre in general, and how religiously observant you are tends to feed into that. But if you're a few pence short, you're sleeping in a place where there's nothing to smell or feel but bugs. So again, that sense of precarity which really comes through. So Mayhew's work is famous for its text. It's also famous for its illustrations as well. So these are some were originally daguerreotypes, which is the only form of photograph, but daguerreotypes can't be kind of reproduced in the same way that photographs are today. So in the published work itself, they take the form of woodcut illustrations. Similar, very well, the same technology, not similar, the same as is featured in the much more famous Illustrated London News, of which in fact Mayhew was an early contributor. And this scene here is a dinner at a cheap lodging house, and we get a sense of the way this world is presented. The people look kind of down on their luck in terms of their clothes, their lack of shoes, their facial expressions. At the same time, the figure in the centre there's sort of an element of inhibition going on as well, just to add to the atmosphere. And the very guarded, defensive body language as well, and lack of furniture, all adding to this impression of this not being a very nice place to be. So Mayhew was famous for his text, for his prose, but also for his use of statistics. He was trying to quantify what living conditions were like, and it's fair to say, I think, that these wouldn't pass sort of a modern a modern sense of statistical rigour. For example, and this is you'll see this in the exhibition there, in 1841 he describes the figure of around 2,000 street traders as absurdly low, and he posits a figure instead of around 30,000 street traders. But as I understand it, the way in which that he arrived at that figure was to count the number of street traders in a given street, and then sort of multiply that by London as a whole. Obviously, not taking into account the differences in population, in character of the different neighbourhoods. Rachel put this quite nicely when she said he likes statistics so much he tends to make them up. So we have that aspect of Mayhew. He's sort of a pioneer, an early proponent of the genre, but we see works later influenced and sometimes in terms of imitation, but also influenced in terms of trying to subtly or not so subtly do things differently from Mayhew. And one figure that really kind of builds on Mayhew's work is Gustave Doré and Blanchard Gerald. So Doré, I think it's pronounced Doré, excuse me, Doré and Gerald. Doré is the illustrator, and then Blanchard Gerald was a journalist, and they produced this book, London: A Pilgrimage. This is a 1970s edition. Sits in our library, very much worth a read. And it's from this book, as we heard, that the title Shadows and Sunlight comes from. The idea being that the narrative device for this book is a pilgrimage. So Doré and Gerald walk around London describing and later illustrating what they see, and the idea is that they're showing London in its light and its shade. So they're prepared to not only talk about the celebrated bits of London, but the wealth that was coming into London, its developments, but also the less salubrious parts as well. And with over 180 illustrations accompanied by text, it does give us a really interesting insight into what London will be like. But again, we have to take some of it with a pinch of salt, or not abandon our critical faculties as we're going along. So the book itself, as I say, it takes the form of a pilgrimage, starting around the River Thames, going west, and then heading east, interspersed with these illustrations. And here we see part of the reflection on London's market life. Again, I won't read the whole thing for you. I'll let you do that in your own time. But we do get an important sense of the streets are choked with wagons and barrows, street vendors of all kind, and of the poorest of each kind, it's the coffee stall keepers. So what we're seeing again is a bustling street life, a London that's sort of struggling with its new population. The infrastructure is not quite fit for purpose, all the while with people being surrounded by a degree of poverty, and this tension between, in the sense of the street traders, people who are certainly working, but the amount of money that brings in is really only just enough to keep them keep them together. So that's his description of Covent Garden there, and we'll hold it. Excuse me. There we go. And here we have another example of the kind of the famous and evocative imagery accompanied by the text. And this is quite interesting on two counts, really, in terms of the text itself, because what we're starting to see here is a little bit of quite light, and the book was sometimes criticised for its the lightness of the commentary, but we're getting some sense, or at least hinting at an economic analysis of talking about why people are poor. And we can see here in Covent Garden there is a higgler or middleman who buys from the producer to sell to the retailer, who will in turn sell to the humble customer. The rich man buys first hand, the poor man fifth hand. The sense there, of course, is that if you have money, you can use that to save money, and as it's sometimes put, it's expensive being poor, and especially so in Victorian London. So one of the themes that pervades this genre is the idea of contrast, of not just that some people are very poor, but they are living alongside people with a lot more wealth than them. So here we see the violent contrast of London struck Addison as they still strike every close observer. But in his day, the contrasts were not so crowded together as they are now. The poor were not in such imposing legions. So Addison is a sort of an essayist of a few generations previous, co-founder of the Spectator magazine. So what we see here in this in this analysis is the idea of something breaking down again, isn't it? So it's not that they weren't always rich and poor, but that somehow something is going wrong because they are on top of each other, and that there are so many of them sort of side by side, and the kind of the quantity of things are changing. As you might imagine, this work, London: A Pilgrimage, had a very mixed reaction when it was released. Some people, the more reform-minded, more social critic-minded, believe that it was in fact shining a light on something that needed to be said, something that was being ignored, and therefore it was a useful addition. But many people were had reservations or outright critical about the book. So first of all, there was just the general tone of it, this idea of presenting London in not the best light, no pun intended there. This idea of focusing on the less salubrious aspects of London in itself was seen as somehow improper and therefore worthy of criticism. And there was a sense again that it was that yes, a more subtle criticism that sometimes was levied was not that these things weren't true, but they were changing. They were changing so quickly that the reform was in the air. So the problem was in fact being solved, and therefore it was again sort of improper to dwell on this too much. And these criticisms particularly were sort of strengthened by the idea that Doré didn't like sketching in public. So he went around, Gerald and Doré went around, interestingly escorted by plainclothes policemen, which is a contrast to later investigators who seemed perfectly happy to go around sort of, in sort of pairs or singularly, which perhaps suggests that the danger is somewhat exaggerated. This idea of saying you're escorted by a policeman gives a frisson there that might not necessarily be true. That's part of the sort of the marketing of the effort, rather than a sort of a necessity for protection. So as they're going round, Doré was famous for not liking sketching in public. So he would observe, and then he'd come back and sort of sketch in the kind of the privacy of his own space. And therefore inaccuracies inevitably crept in. And these were used, say, to amplify those criticisms, to say that it was an exaggeration, the details weren't right, he was sketching from memory. For what it's worth, I think that slightly misses the point. The value in these illustrations, so their famous self-use of light and shade, described as chiaroscuro, is that they are evocative. It is that they kind of capture a scene, they capture a feeling, so that they're not, just because they're not 100% realistic, to me is slightly missing the point. But that was a criticism that was taken seriously, and is part of the kind of the inspiration for our next sort of journalistic and illustrator pair. So this time we have Adolphe Smith and John Thompson. So that's Adolphe Smith on the left, who's quite an imposing figure, I think, in that picture, and John Thompson on the right there. So there are some strong parallels in this work that they produced, Street Life London, which is published between 1876 and 1877, first of a series of articles and then compiled as a book. So we have a similar thing in that we have a journalist kind of going about taking people's stories, kind of presenting life stories, presenting their view on it, and they are illustrated, but in this time, the illustration is not sort of drawn; it's illustrated with photographs. And so that's Smith on the right, and that's John Thompson on the right, who became quite a celebrated photographer in his age, famous in the decade preceding the publication of the Street Life London series for touring China and East Asia with his camera and bringing back these images here. And obviously that's the context, that image on the right hand side as you look at it. So Street Life London is available in various forms online. As I should have said, in fact, as is Doré's work and Mayhew. So some illustrations from Doré's work is available on the London Picture Archive, of which you can see on the screen here, and Mayhew is available. So it's in our library here, but actually it's quite awkward to use sometimes, the size of the volumes and the print. So that's available online as well, reproduced in various forms, very easy to find. So the illustrations for Street Life London, as I say, are also available on the London Picture Archive. You can search for them individually should you choose, or you can use this little collection view as well. It's fairly self-explanatory, so I won't sort of hijack the narrative by going into that there, but just be aware that is there. And indeed, you can. There's various open access versions of the whole book as well, if you want the accompanying text. And they are well worth reading side by side by side, as good as the photographs are when they're held in isolation. They're particularly nice with the text as well, because the pieces are short but full of detail, and they're based on interviews with a range of sort of men and women that Adolphe Smith spoke to. And we'll see some examples of them now, some of which are reproduced in the exhibition, some of which aren't. So we talked earlier, didn't we, about the mortality that stalked London. First we spoke specifically about cholera, but various other diseases, typhus, smallpox, for example, that easily spread in the insanitary and crowded conditions of Victorian London. But as the century is going on, there are more sophisticated measures being taken to try and fight these diseases, as various municipal bodies, first the Metropolitan Board of Works, later the London County Council, various parochial bodies as well, start to sort of gather together to combat these things. And this image here is an example of that. So described as the public disinfectors. These are people that basically take the clothes and possessions of people that have had some kind of disease, described as zygotic at the time, which I think we can infer is things like, again, smallpox and typhus. They basically take their possessions and either destroy them or try and sanitize them. So what we can learn from this text is that will either involve boiling them. So if it's some fabrics and the like, they'll be boiled for 20 minutes, or larger items will actually be placed in an oven where the hot dry heat is described as breaking down the zygotic diseases. And that's what we're seeing here. So these are two of the disinfectors about to go on about their work, and there'll be an oven in that premises there that they can use for these larger items. And you might notice their distinct dress. So these overcoats would seem to help protect them from the effects of the disease, that the overalls would sort of catch the disease. They could then be cleaned afterwards. So a sort of early form of PPE. One of the one of the things that really comes through this literature as a theme is kind of the life of street traders. So that's people that are working, as we heard, they are working, but it's hard work. Poverty is never that far away. They're selling small things for a little markup to people who have maybe just a little bit more money than them. And this is I think the subtext, or the text really behind this dealer in fancy wear, as they're described by Smith and Thompson. And again, it's a long excerpt, so I won't read the whole thing to you. But what I think a few bits I'd like to give a sense of, I'd like to pick out of this is, first of all, the use of the railway, so that they can get about a bit further. So by this point in time, London is spreading out because of the railway, adding both new opportunities but new hardship as well. And also quite like this last line. Sunday to most of us is a day for loafing and liquoring. So partly it's this interesting thing of seeing how the speech is reproduced. Sometimes this is described as caricature, sometimes it's described as an attempt to be faithful to how people spoke. But I think this idea of loafing and liquoring is interesting, because that can be seen, I think, I would say fairly, but I would say that as a perfectly reasonable thing to do on your day off. You're working very hard in all weathers, physical work. Why wouldn't you want to have some comfort and relax? But at the same time, you can see how these things are sometimes taken out of context. That would be a perfectly reasonable behaviour in someone that that had more money is seen as somehow being a sign of being indolent and of dissolute habits in someone with less wealth. And then another important thing, which we'll pick up a little bit more when we spend some time with Booth in the final part of this talk, is precariety. I've hinted at it quite a lot already. And this is Caney the clown. Even among the street folks of London, there are not so many who can boast so varied a career as the hero of this chapter. Caney, whose name it will be seen, expressed the nature of his work, once enjoyed the exalted position attributed to those who belong to the pro. So he was a very accomplished clown, accomplished sort of a street and theatre performer, but now Caney implies that he's making chairs and other furniture other furniture of a similar sort of size and shape. And this is likely piecework. This was a common thing that people in London would do. So by piecework, we mean that you'd be paid to make a single item. You'd be paid per item. So obviously, if you're not making the item, you're not being paid, and often the rate you get for that one item was quite low. And it's probably worth mentioning that was a very important part of the London economy at this time. So we've been talking about how London's been growing, about the context of the industrial revolution, and when we think of industrialization, we tend to think of factories, particularly the big factories and factory towns of the north. And there were some factories in London, particularly as the 19th century turns into the 20th. But for many years, economic historians have remarked on actually how little factories were present in London, despite the huge volume of people and the huge volume of wealth. And actually, Jerry White, the very famous London historian, has described London as one great factory. Basically, the various kind of the various aspects of production are kind of farmed out to different districts, and those become the various stages in the factory system, rather than it all being in one building. And Caney's work here is an important example of that. But the other thing that we find out from this article is that Caney used to work as a clown, used to work as a performer, but he basically breaks his leg in a performance and can no longer work like that. And this, as I say, becomes a real theme of the work of Booth, who will come out presently, realizing that lots of people could work, were willing to work, to use Mayhew's formulation from the start, but they're really only one misfortune away from poverty. That could be accident, that could be injury, or it could quite often simply be old age. Don't quite want to describe it as a misfortune, but you know what I mean by that. That these sort of natural life events that happen. If you don't have a safety net, if you don't have that wealth, can kind of force you into poverty. I think we will. How are we doing for time? I think we'll skip that one. So this is it's a long extract from a short pamphlet that was produced in 1883 by the London Congregational Union, whose archive is held here at the London Archives. And again, a long extract, and not necessarily won't read the whole thing out, but do have a sort of a scan through and kind of absorb the tone of it. I particularly think to get into them, you have to penetrate courts reeking with poisonous and malodorous gases arising from accumulations of sewage and refuse scattered in all directions. So what they're talking about here is the homes of the poor. And then if you're not driven back by that intolerable stench, you may gain admittance to the dens in which these thousands of beings who belong as much to you, to the race for whom Christ died, herd together. So a very strong kind of purple, lurid description of the housing of the poor in London. And as you might guess from this from this tone, this was a campaigning work, as I say, initially published anonymously by the London Congregational Union, but after the kind of basically outcry that it ensued, we learn that the author was one Reverend Mayans, and his goals were firstly to revive church attendance, which he'd seen as falling amongst the poor, and to improve the conditions of their homes. And this is and as the tone of it suggests, this wasn't directed at the people that were living in these houses. This was directed at the middle and the upper classes as a way of some kind of campaigning to improve these conditions. And therefore there is a a real motivation to kind of play into the stereotypes, to make things very kind of strong, very lurid, really paint quite a nasty picture of things. That's a theme of quite a lot of this literature, but really made very vivid in this text. And it was that tone, that characterization, which really put off Charles Booth, who is probably, alongside Mayhew, the most famous of the figures that we'll be talking about today. And we'll spend the last sort of 10 minutes or so of the presentation talking about Charles Booth. The story you have from Charles Booth, which I rather like, is that he. And I should say, just by context, Charles Booth is a Liverpudlian-born businessman. Starts from a fairly modest but comfortable background, but through his sort of business acumen and hard work in the leather and shipping industries, becomes a very wealthy man indeed. The picture I have of Charles Booth sort of talking with his sort of wealthy and society friends, and basically he gets into a disagreement with one of them about the extent of London poverty. So one of the people at this dinner party that I'm imagining tells Charles Booth that a quarter of people of London live in poverty, and Charles Booth doesn't believe the figure. He doesn't think it can be that high. And what I think is to his immeasurable credit, he doesn't believe the figure, but he realizes he has no way of disputing the figure. So actually goes and thinks about, how can I find this out? How can I do the research? And this is a task that really consumes and defines the rest of his career. He's sometimes seen as the first sociologist in working in a British context, inventing a famous statistician, and famous for presenting his work, as we'll soon see, in map form. And what's interesting is that he conducts these surveys that we will hear a little bit more about, and he ends up disagreeing that the figure of a quarter of people living in poverty is correct. We're finding it's actually more than he thought, that a third of Londoners are living in poverty at this time, which is sort of round about 1880. And Booth is most famous, I think, or Booth's name, if you hear the Booth, you're going to associate it with this map that we can see on the screen here. This is the famous Booth poverty map. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with it, but by no means all. And the Booth poverty maps, which were actually produced in two editions, about 10 years apart. They describe the wealth of London's inhabitants via their colour, ranging from gold to well off. Red implies of the middling sort, from purple, blue, and black, denoting people with really no money in very difficult financial circumstances. This is an overview from the Layers of London website. I'm not expecting you to pick out any detail on it, but it's just nice to see the extent of the coverage. So instead, we have a zoomed in version here, and this is Southwark. This is Collier's Court. Collier's Rent in Southwark, just off Borough High Street. So on the left, we see the map. This one is taken from Layers of London, but it's also available on the London Picture Archive site. And on the right-hand side there, we have the London Picture Archive image for Collier's Rent as well. So what I might do, I might just turn the lights down a tiny bit, because it might be nice to have a bit more detail. Sorry about that. I hope you caught that at home. I was just turning the lights down so we get a little bit more. Definition. So just to remind you, the various colours show the wealth or poverty of the people that live in the various locations. So red implies a middling sort, and then from there, basically, the darker the colour, the poorer, and indeed when we get to black, in Booth's estimation, kind of the worse the character of the people that live there. So in this scheme, black is described as chronic want, vicious and semi-criminal. So we can see that link here again between kind of wealth and character. And what I think is worth really bearing in mind is the detail that Booth has put into these maps, or put into the survey that will produce the maps, I should probably say, and how he's going really street by street, location by location, and how this gives us a really clear view of perhaps that impression that we have of Victorian London from journalistic works we've seen before, literary works such as Dickens and the like as well. So if we take Borough High Street on the left hand side there, that's the main road, red, middling sort. But as soon as we start to get off these streets, things start to get a little bit more murky, a little bit more unpleasant. The red gives way to blue, which gives way to black. And let me get this in the right order. And in this next slide, we can see perhaps some of the reasons why some areas would be blue, some will be black, and some will be red, and get some sense at least of the living conditions that people would be, I think it's fair to say, enduring. So this is South London again. This is Bermondsey, Parish of St Mary Magdalene, Bursley. I chose this screen because actually it was part of a sort of a family history that one of my colleagues did for his family history, and we'll talk about, and we'll see where their ancestors lived in a moment's time. But what I want to just draw your attention to, I'll use the little pointer for the benefit of the people in the room, is this tannery in the middle. So, but if you're at home, really right in the middle of the map, where it says St Mary Magdalene, if you just go up a little bit, you can see a tannery. So a tannery is a place where leather is produced, and this is very dirty, smelly, unpleasant work. And can you see how effectively the properties that back onto this are this dark blue colour, implying they're not very nice places to live at all. We have the blue and the black, and then on the main road there, a little bit further away, still, I think you'd still be aware that it was there, don't get me wrong, but we have on the main road we have the red. And how really that pattern is repeated across the map. You know, think about those images of kind of dark streets, back streets, rookeries, unpleasant dens, all the kind of the lurid stereotypes that were employed at the time, and you can see how this is reflected in Booth's map. And this is a little plug for another site that's not ours. I should say that although the maps and the survey the survey volumes were published, so you see them in many institutions. The Museum of London and the LSC archive and library have some of the more unique documents. So the first edition working maps live at the Museum of London, but the second edition working maps and the original notebooks from which the surveys and this map and the Booth surveys which produce the map were compiled, they live at LSE, and they've done all a very wonderful thing. They've put these surveys online. So this is the same area that we saw before. Can you see St Mary Magdalene and the tannery there? There's these various blobs on them, and that is pinned to those locations is some of the original archive document which relates to that area. And if I go forward one, this is Mellick Place. I want to draw your attention to Mellick's Place, which was, so I've skipped forward, I'm going to go back again, apologies for that. Mellick's Place is one of these ones that goes right behind the tannery there. So that's that street there, and sorry to mess you around, to go forward. And this slide here is just a zoomed in version of the previous one. So these are available, as I say, on this LSE website, and they give us a sense of what the kind of the raw material that builds up onto the map, which I should say was conducted by surveys by Booth, and in two iterations. First, Booth alongside what's called the London School Board visitors, and then his second survey just before the end of the 20th century, in the 1890s, so start 20th century. That's with a kind of a more dedicated team, which includes most famously Beatrice Webb, Beatrice Potter, but various other associates of Booth as well. And what we see here, as I say, is the description and how that's going to contribute to the final map. So I'll let you read that before, but I just want to see how it's a combination of geographical description, just trying to understand what the buildings look like, with things like very rough, always has been, gossiping, untidy women, many broken windows, etc. And so it goes on. And then finally, you can see at the bottom there, Bermondsey Place, a paved cul-de-sac, terrible children. And this is quite, what's interesting about this is that Booth was very against the kind of the lurid, the kind of the lurid nature of much of this genre, but how these sort of judgments still creep in nevertheless. And what you can see if you compare the published volumes, which I should say across Booth's lifetime, 17 volumes were published as Life and Labour of the People in London, which are all available in our library here. They were, and these obviously contain much more information than the maps do alone. But what we see in the notebooks and these kinds of descriptions here available on the LSE website is perhaps more behind the scenes sort of judgments. There's an attempt in the printed volumes said to be that little bit more objective. Booth had sort of pretensions or aspirations of presenting this as a kind of a rational problem to be solved, and you see that little contradiction there in the two sources. This is the last slide, but it's probably worth just mentioning sort of the legacy of Booth's Booth research, because it's a disputed legacy, and actually indeed there's a sort of disputed legacy for all the work that we're doing. So some people will argue that Booth's work did sort of make a material impact, and the way that it did that was effectively through the London County Council. So one of the big changes right at the end of the 19th century is the formulation of the London County Council. So now finally London has a municipal body kind of proper sort of size and scale to tackle some of the social problems that it's facing. And to many people's surprise, the first elections to London County Council returned many kind of people that we would describe, well, they describe themselves as progressive, keen to sort of roll up their sleeves and deal with some of these social problems. And although Booth was somewhat objective in his manner, those statistics, that information he produced, were real kind of tools weapons in the arsenal of these progressives. They were able to say there is this problem, and Booth's work proves it. And the really big cause that Booth took up in his own lifetime wasn't housing or the working poor. His real concern became that of the elderly. He realised that a huge proportion of people in poverty were people that were simply too old to work as they had done previously, and there was no safety there. And he really actually alienated himself from some of his social circle by advocating very early on for a kind of a universal old age pension, which wasn't brought about in Booth's lifetime, but was instigated as sort of a big part of the plank of the Liberal government in 1908. So on that sort of semi-optimistic note, we'll kind of draw the formal presentation to a close. But if you have questions, comments, or indeed corrections, I'll be very happy to take them now. So thank you. So what we'll do, I think it's probably easier if we start with any questions in the room. And what I'll do is I'll repeat the question for the benefit of people at home. We do have a room mic here, but I'm not sure how well it picks things up. And then we'll move on to questions from home. There's obviously no obligation to ask a question, but if you have any, we're very happy to take them. So over to you.
What's that picture?
Well, that's me being slightly frivolous, but that's the London County. So excuse me, the question was, what's the picture on the screen? That's me being slightly playful with the image. This is the first meeting of the London County Council. Again, from London Picture Archive.
Where is that?
Where or when? Or 1889, I want to say off the top of my head, but there or thereabouts. Yeah. Jolly good. So the other question was, what was the date of this picture? So 1889 or thereabouts, maybe a little bit later, but that sort of time. Any questions from home, Rachel?
Not yet, but that's a delay.
Okay, that's fine. We'll let that breathe and see if there are any questions from home.
Sorry, I have to sort it out.
Yes.
The very first slide, I couldn't see the date. The view from the
Oh yes.
room.
So the very first slide we open with, I'll go back. If you feel seasick, close your eyes. I always find it a bit jarring. So the question was, what's the date of this slide? 1884. So this is a balloon view of 1884. So again, towards the end of the trip, I thought it was just sort of suitably atmospheric for our kind of overview of London, and I like a little bit of a pun. So it's a balloon view. So it's an overview. You see what I did there? I'm here all day. Yeah.
We have a question.
Jolly good. Well, I'll stop doing terrible stand-up then, which is very timely. Apologies. Yes, the question from home, Rachel. Thank you.
Would you describe Booth as a more reliable source than Mayhew? For example, he's received criticism for his uneven research and for relying on uncorroborated opinions from clergymen and policemen.
And those criticisms applied to Booth, if I understood that correctly.
Yes. Basically, the question is: would you describe Booth as a more reliable source than Mayhew?
More reliable, yes. Totally reliable, no. I'd put it like that. I think Booth's aspirations to kind of objectivity and rigour far outweigh that of Mayhew. Booth had a sort of a team behind him. He's systematic. We talked about how Mayhew. I'm being slightly flippant. I don't mean to be, but sort of counted the people in an area and then scaled it up. That is going to be less accurate than Booth Booth and his team, street by street. But that point you mentioned there about his sources, I think it's absolutely right. There is throughout this whole kind of genre, this whole approach, there is that question of these are outsiders talking and investigating the lives of other people. What breaks down there? There's this strange assumption really that it's perfectly okay to go and knock on someone's door. How do you live? That you'll be invited into their lives, and then you'll get the unvarnished truth there. So that kind of as a methodological point does require a certain degree of skepticism and intelligent reading of the sources. Absolutely.
And do the books need to be ordered in the reference area, or are they on display on the shelf?
Oh, great, yes. So the books are available in the reference area. So quite easy to find, but one of my colleagues can point you to that if you're interested in the books, and they'll say they're well worth a read. Lots of people say that they're the real connoisseur's choice. That it's plebs like me that we like the map, but the kind of the connoisseur's choice is to look at the volumes. And some people say they're sort of as good as a novel actually. That despite the stress on objectivity, the vignettes and the scenes that are recorded are really well worth reading and kind of a rewarding use of your time. Thank you. Any more questions from home, Rachel? Well, in which case we'll draw that to a close there. So thank you very much for joining us in person. Thank you very much for joining us at home. Our exhibition on Lost Victorian London runs until January. So if you are able to make it to us, please come along. There are various other events on this and other sort of themes of London history on Bookable on Eventbrite as we speak. So hopefully I might see you at some of them as well. So thank you all again.